Thank you so much for watching. My name is Glenn Morgan, and this is We the Govern. Now, today's going to be kind of an unusual topic, not so much the general topic of elections and understanding about how they work, but essentially, very specifically, a story that I'm going to do here about unfortunately, a simple way to cheat in mail-in elections. I'm going to use a Snohomish County case study example here, and I think it's important that people hear the story, and this has been one I've been meaning to tell for quite some time, and I feel like I've kind of let everybody down by even waiting as long as I did to tell the story, but I think it's necessary and something that people just be aware of. These are the kind of stories I don't normally get into too often, but it was a lot of people that were involved in doing the research on this, and I just think it's worth exposing the truth about what's actually happening out there in Washington State or any other place that happens to use mail-in voting. Now, I'm going to point out right here, looking down below, obviously, one of the things that we have seen with our political establishment in Washington State is second only to protecting illegal violent criminals. They seem to be obsessively focused on defending the mail-in voting program that we have in Washington State, and they will threaten litigation and jail time against almost anybody who dares to raise any question at all about how perfect and amazing and incredibly safe and impossible to cheat their existing system is right now. If you've seen anything lately, you'll see stuff like this. And one of the things I want to point out here is that a lot of this came out of this tweet, True Social post, I should say. It wasn't really a tweet, where basically Trump came out and said that he wanted to end mail-in voting. Now, he indicated he was going to do an executive order, which I don't think is the path that he's likely to go down. I already did a video about that. But it does seem like it's something that he could go and generate more attention on when it comes to bad behavior in elections. And of course, as soon as Trump came out and did that, you had the political class in Washington State panic like it was the end of the world and respond like, how dare anybody question our oddball system that we have in our state, because it's been working so perfectly without flaw for so long, and how dare anybody actually raise any questions about it? Which of course brings me to basically my ask before we get too far into this. If you haven't hit the subscribe and like button, please do that down below as soon as you possibly can. It doesn't cost you anything but a few seconds of your time, and it does help you if it helps get the word out. If you like this content, feel free to share it with other people. The more that actually get a chance to see it, the more a significant impact I believe that we can actually make in the political process, not just in Washington State, but in other parts of the country, because the rest of the country doesn't need to make the same dumb mistakes that our state has made. And sometimes it may be that your bad political decisions that your political class has made, certainly in our state of Washington, exist merely to serve as an example to others about what not to do. So let's go back to this simple story that I have here about a simple way to cheat in mail-in elections, and I'm going to focus on the Snohomish County case study, and I really think this is a story that needs to be told. It is one that snuck up on me by surprise a little bit at the time. It wasn't something I was looking for, and a lot of credit goes to other people for actually doing this hard research. And let me just get into this story so you kind of understand the setting and really where I'm coming from here. I've been a critic of mail-in voting for a long time, and anybody that's paid any attention to both what I've done here or before when I worked at the Freedom Foundation, you know that there's been a lot of critique that I've had long before it was cool and long before anybody discovered that there were problems with elections back in 2020 or 2016. It really started for me back in 2010, and really before that when I paid attention to the Dina Rossi Gregoire fiasco in 2004. But there's obviously a lot of problems that plague mail-in voting. Chain of custody being biggest issue. Who the heck actually got their hands on your ballots, both before they get to your house? Do they end up in the ditch, and that's why you don't get them? Do they get thrown in storm drains so that nobody finds them? Are they basically piled up in a warehouse somewhere, and somebody's paying somebody to fill out those ballots for others? You know, just like those farm workers that told me one time about selling their ballots for $30. They weren't U.S. citizens, and I'm sure that leftist group that bought those ballots had no plans to use them to commit any kind of fraud. There's a lot of problems that have existed with mail-in voting. Again, I don't want to get into all of them. I'm just going to go into one specific example here. Again, most of my focus has been on trying to clean up Washington State's voter rolls, and you've seen a couple of my videos about the deficiencies that exist there and how much harder it is to commit fraud or bad behavior anyway if your voter rolls are a lot cleaner. It's something that we've known about since long before the Reconstruction South and the Democrats first figured out how to game the voting system there and prevent Republicans and freed slaves from voting in the elections. Now, the other issue I want to point out here is that oftentimes the biggest issue when you're discovering problems and you find them, and it's very difficult as you're digging into a system that's not transparent, that a lot of secret sauce, black box efforts go into running these election systems. And when you do find a problem, what they'll always do is they'll tell you to blame the other guy. The Secretary of State will blame the Department of Licensing, or they'll blame the auditors will blame the Secretary of State, and the Department of Licensing will blame the Secretary of State. Everybody blames everybody else. Nobody's at fault. Shifting the blame is a long career path for most bureaucrats and politicians in Washington State. It's not just unique to our state. It's the kind of thing that happens everywhere. However, one of the ways that really does help people understand when you look at elections is that it's not about trust. Elections are not about trusting. If people tell you, trust us, it's just working well, that's the big red flag that it's not working well. Elections work because adversarial political parties or people, at least certainly adversarial ideas, are being contested and the public is deciding which path they want to go down. And so the point isn't trust. The point is actually to distrust, but to have observers there and have the process be so transparent that both sides follow the rules, or if there's more than two sides, all sides follow the rules, and it's very transparent and obvious to all, whether that's dipping your finger in ink and proving that you were there, showing ID, demonstrating you were there, whatever it is that passes for distrust but verify in the place that's having the election. And sometimes you have to put your mind in the eye of a criminal and understand how could this system be manipulated and what would they try to do to manipulate it if they chose to do so. And so that's really what I want to talk about is if you're already willing to commit a criminal act, and it's the same kind of mentality that people have to be aware of. Like if somebody's going to break into your house, do you leave all your valuables out in the open? No, you don't. You put them in a safe, or you try to hide them, or you in some way protect your resources from theft. You don't put your bank account information out there for everybody to see on your Facebook account so that somebody can steal your money. I mean, there's just common sense things you do. But you got to put yourself in the mind of a criminal, and what would they do? And a criminal, if they're going to go commit a criminal activity, number one, they have to look at, is it worth the risk? Is it really worth doing? And I think when it comes to fraud in elections, it can be easily worth doing. In fact, it could be the most valuable thing anybody's ever done if a criminal does it, because government directs billions of dollars into deep, dark holes that oftentimes nobody's really looking at or paying attention to. And that money can be diverted and spent on almost anything. And if there's one thing we know that criminals will want to do if they can get their hands on it is money. And if this is the path to get there, why would you not do something dishonest to change the outcome of an election to make sure you get your resources and cash that you want to get? Secondly, they want to do something that's limited exposure. You're less likely to be caught. It's always, a criminal will mostly try to do things where they can't get caught or they think it's difficult to get caught. An intelligent criminal, and I presume that anybody who's capable enough to commit fraud or cheat in elections is going to be adequately intelligent enough to know that you're more likely to get away with something if it's very simple. You're more likely to not get caught if it's simple, and you're more likely to be successful. And then finally, one of the perfect elements for a criminal when they're considering committing a crime is it impossible for anybody to really figure out who did this later? There's no evidence left behind. It's kind of the perfect crime, right? It's worth the risk, low exposure, keeping it simple, and it's impossible to ever be tracked down later on. So this is kind of how a criminal would think, and why would they think anything differently? This is no different than when I'm looking at corruption cases with Doge Washington training or whistleblowers long before anybody ever heard of Doge, and you're digging into corruption cases in government, but you can always follow the money. And inevitably, the money might have disappeared or it might have ended up in somebody's pocket, but at least you can follow the money and find out how government wasted, squandered, or stole the tax dollars you gave it. Those those are relatively straightforward issues. But when it comes to elections, you're trying to figure out where this thing went, right? This ballot here, who got it, where did it go? There's no chain of custody. Are those results actually accurate? All these kind of issues that tend to pop up when you're talking about all mail-in elections. Unfortunately, it also creates lots of conspiracy theories that are unrealistic or unworkable once you dig into how the system's set up and you understand, well, that's probably not the way somebody would commit fraud, or that's not the way that you would cheat, or the observations that are set up and the ability to look at things can kind of prevent those types of ideas. But let's not kid ourselves. It's been frequently utilized since the days the concept of an election was created. The concept of cheating in that election was also created about the same time. Once people realize that elections have consequences and that whoever you elect gets to decide something, that's how you're going to lead to people deciding that they want to cheat in an election. And there's no difference here. I mean, this was a story that I mentioned in one of my previous videos, but it was very public back in the 2006 election, and in this case it was a 2007 story about Acorn falsifying all these voter roll records so that they could inflate the voter rolls and falsify these voter IDs, and then get those ballots and mail them all in and change the outcome of elections. Now, of course, what they'd want to convince you is that that was the first and only time they'd ever decide to commit fraud. When they used the Seattle Public Library, and this poor guy right here is the fall guy for what happened at the time, and they really just got caught because he didn't pay the guy $10 an hour. It wasn't him, it was another guy, and that guy turned in the rest of the crew because he didn't get his $10 an hour. And Acorn, in its kind of sloppy operation, just got exposed. And people oftentimes were more surprised at the time that the Seattle Public Library got used for more than just shooting up meth. Now, let's get back to Snohomish County in this case. I live in Thurston County. It's not the county I live in, but Snohomish County is one of the bigger counties in Washington State, just north of King County. And this is where we're going to be talking about what we found. And it has very little actually to do with the people that work in the auditor's office right here. Garth Fell is that auditor there, and he prints all his ballots at a company right here called K&H Printing, located in Everett. In fact, that's not an unusual choice for him to make, because K&H Printing prints 60 million plus ballots or so a year. They print the majority of ballots in Washington State and many other states on the West Coast. So they print massive volumes of ballots. And it just so happens to be in the backyard of Snohomish County. So that's kind of an interesting element. So one of the questions that people sometimes ask, and they don't really think through this too much, because I suspect that the average person just thinks that the auditor's office somehow, or the Secretary of State somehow, this ballot just appears in my mailbox. How did it get here? How did all 17 of these ballots that suddenly showed up in my mailbox, if you live in King County, how did they get here? And there's a basic process for how that happens. This is Garth Fell, who's the auditor in Snohomish County, and he would do what all 39, there's 38 county auditors, there's one elections director in King County, they're the only ones that are a little different, but 39 entities around the state of Washington do this every single election cycle. And so essentially what they do is they say, listen, here's our list of ballots. We've got our vote rolls, and we've looked at these vote rolls, and they're accurate or semi-accurate or as accurate as we're bothering to look into them, and here's our list, and they send it over to the printer. Because after all, how exactly do you get these ballots out there if it doesn't get printed? And that printer happens to be located in Everett. It's K&H Printing. They have the operation to both print and mail the ballots based on the lists that are sent to them from Snohomish County. And then those ballots essentially get out to your average voter in Snohomish County, and then presumably that voter receives the ballot and he votes. This is perfectly normal. This is how mail-in voting actually works. They send these lists out sometimes a month and a half in advance. There's nothing terribly unusual about it. And in the whole process here, everybody can be perfect angels in this process. There's nothing illegal, there's nothing dishonest, there's nothing unusual about this process. The auditor's office can be filled with all the saints and the apostles working there, and the problem that I'm going to expose here could still be going on. It doesn't require corruption inside of the auditor's office. Everybody there could be perfect angels doing just the right thing. And those people receiving the ballots could be sending their ballots in. And K&H could be doing exactly what they do every day. They print these ballots, they send them out with their awesome super secret sauce security. Everything's perfect and everything's great. And yet still the problem that I'm going to explain to you can happen. Now let me just explain here, first of all, That list that the auditor sends across there, I'm picking on Garth Fell because Snohomish County is where we got the story originally, but that list is actually public. Every time the auditor's office in every county sends out that list to the printer, you can get a copy of that list. And so, and at the same time, also, everybody who actually votes, that's public as well. The names of everybody who voted in the election, not how they voted, but the fact that they voted in the election is also public. Those are both two public lists. Historically, they've been public so that anybody who wants to get those lists can actually get them. And this is where we get started. Now, I'm going to go back here real quick. I was not so focused on this at the time. This wasn't something that I was that interested in. It's not that I was unaware of it. It wasn't something that interested me because of the large data sets that were involved at the time. And I was approached by some people who lived up in Snohomish County. They were interested in getting these lists. And so they filed records requests to get these lists. And of course, Snohomish County dragged their feet, as they usually do, and delayed as long as they possibly could, almost 2 years before they actually provided all this information of the requested lists that they sent to the printer. And there was some real interesting information that came out of it. And they had actually contacted me originally and said, Glenn, should we, this is what we're doing, we're filing this list, this is what we're looking for. And I have to completely confess, and Doug, this is my apology to you in advance. I told you go for it and do it, but I honestly, deep in my heart, I didn't think you were going to find anything that mattered, and I felt like it was going to be digging into something that wasn't going to necessarily produce any results. I still encourage people to go down and file records requests because even dry holes can sometimes at least identify that maybe there's nothing to see there. But nevertheless, they went down this very difficult path for a couple years, sorting out this data and then cross-referencing it with who actually voted. And that is a useful thing. Meanwhile, what I was doing was running around in mostly all over the state with the Washington Voter Research Project, doorbelling and homes and going through lists of people who appeared based on the NCOA, which is the National Change of Address Update System, and other data sets that we were using to find people that didn't seem to exist. Somehow they were voting, but they didn't seem to exist. You go to the house, nobody was there. And we had a high rate of anomalies in this effort, and a lot of volunteers all over the place, including in Snohomish County, who were doing this. There was an article from the Seattle Times that came out, and generally what the media would do is they would threaten you indirectly, or they would quote auditors who wanted to put you in jail for daring to ask these questions. Spokane, Thurston, King in particular, Whatcom, they seemed very threatened by the fact that anybody dared to actually care about trying to clean up the voter rolls, and the Seattle Times article kind of highlighted that here. So while I'm in the middle of doing that, I get this contact back from the follow-up after a couple years in Snohomish County about what's going on with this voter roll. And one thing to remember is Snohomish County is a reasonably sized county. There's 518,878 registered voters exactly when the election happened. And of those, they claim to have received 441,921 people voted in the county. This is in 2020. This is the 2020 election here, in case I wasn't clear. And so presidential election, big turnout, lots of people voting. And that ended up being, for those of you who are a little math challenged, and that's understandable, particularly if you went through the public school system and you had Common Core math as your background, but that's about an 85% voter turnout. It's a little bit more than that, which is slightly higher than the state average, but not a huge amount. State average was around 84%, so 85% is just a little bit higher, but not particularly high for the county. That's not what was interesting, because this was very public record. You can see it right now if you go back and pull the election results. What was interesting is that when the activists up there compiled the comprehensive list from Snohomish County of every ballot that was requested from K&H Printing there in Everett, 28,000 of the people who actually did vote, there was no record of any ballot that was requested. Now I'm going to clarify, because there's a couple of specific examples of situations where this could happen. You could have somebody who was an inactive voter who had been removed from the voter rolls officially, but not, so they weren't getting ballots sent out to them, but they were still technically a registered voter in Washington State. That person, for whatever reason, they loved Trump, they hated Trump, they had an epiphany somehow in the middle of the election after the ballots had been mailed and requested from K&H Printing, and by God, they got off their couch and decided they were going to vote anyway. Again, love Trump, hate Trump, who knows? But they came down to the auditor's office and they got the ballots for them. They also had some other people who registered late, so it was after the ballots had been sent out, and so the auditor's office has records of this, and you can actually track and see how many of those people would fit that category. But it wasn't 28,000 people. It was closer to 8,000 when you added all that up, a little less. And at the end of the day, there was essentially this weird data set of 20,000 ballots of people who voted, but nobody had ever actually requested a ballot for them. Conveniently, several hundred of them had shown up on our anomaly list that we had doorbelled. And we had proven by going to the door that there was nobody there. They hadn't existed. The people who lived there hadn't. Sometimes if they knew their name, they knew they'd moved out of state or somewhere else, or had died, or had been disappeared long ago. But regardless, somehow they had voted, but there was no record of them even existing in many cases. And so several hundred of these people had been on our doorbelling list, and that was why they had kind of followed up with me, and they said, listen, it looks like we got about 20,000 of these ballots here. And there's no real good way to explain that. When the Snohomish County auditor was confronted by it, Garth Fell here, he eventually hemmed and hawed, didn't know what to say, couldn't explain it, has no explanation to this day, and basically just said it's not his job to figure out what happened there. He just somehow counts, and he's a counter, sends out the list, and it's our problem, not his, that weirdly enough, they got all these extra bonus ballots that came in for people who they'd never requested a ballot for. Now, here's what's kind of interesting. To understand why this kind of matters, you have to understand the difference between an active and an inactive voter list. Now, essentially, and this is more of a federal law, when somebody hasn't voted and participated in multiple presidential election cycles, they no longer have ballots sent out to them. Because remember, in Washington State, we send out ballots like confetti. We broadcast it everywhere. We send lots of ballots to lots of people, and we have lots of problems in our voter rolls, and this is part of my other stuff that I focused on in the past, where we'll register people multiple times, slight variations on their name. But the problem is we send lots of ballots out there, but people move all the time. Any given year, you're going to have somewhere around roughly 10% of the population will move a year. Now, they don't necessarily leave the state. They're moving sometimes just down the road or the next county over. But what happens is this builds up a crufty voter list, especially the way we re-register people in Washington State. And so if somebody hasn't voted for some period of time, they get shifted into this inactive voter list. And so that's following compliant with federal law, that's what they do. Inactive voters, once you're on that list, the only significant difference to you as that voter is that nobody's sending out that ballot anymore. Whoever's moved into your house, they've been getting your ballot for years, they're sick of it, and now finally you haven't voted long enough and they were honest enough not to vote for you, and so you're technically shifted into this kind of gray list of inactive voters. But you're still considered a registered voter in Washington State until they completely remove you from the list, which the counties are inconsistent in actually doing. However, what that means is that in this case, roughly 20,000, or it's a little more than that, but about 20,000 or more ballots basically were inactive but somehow had ballots printed and received by the auditor's office and counted as legal voters, not somebody who had been on any inactive list. And I had accidentally, not in coordination with them, but we had doorbelled hundreds of them and found out none of those people existed. We did not doorbell to 20,000 because we didn't have that list at the time. And again, the further away from the election, remember now by this time it's several years after the election, the data becomes less and less current or relevant. Now, I point that out also, too, because what it appears is that the Snohomish County Auditor's Office did the right thing by not mailing out not requesting those ballots to be printed or mailed. But the bigger question is, how did they get printed? And then the second question is, well, wait a second, what would happen if they came in? Now, the story had been that the ballot counting machine that basically takes these ballots in before they're opened, so it's before they're even counted, and they run the envelopes through. There's barcodes on the outside of the envelope that identify the voter that sent in the ballot. And the big question had been, what happens with the Clear Ballot system, which Clear Ballot's the company that has the majority of counting machines that exist in Washington State. What happens when a ballot that has a voter that's been inactive is received and run through the machine? This was a big question. The auditors mostly thought, the elected auditors thought that it would be rejected and that they would have to go back and look at that voter because they'd been on the inactive voter list, but that's not true. What actually happens when an inactive voter ballot is received and it has the correct barcode and it's identified that voter accurately, on the barcode, it just automatically gets counted as an active voter by default. That's what the machine does. Now, it's not an irrational setup on the machine, because you have to presume that people and databases are incompetent and not necessarily that organized, and they don't want to deny people the right to vote or reject ballots that are legal. And when in doubt, always err on the side of the ballot. That's the approach that's taken both in the law and by policy. But the machine automatically counts it. And this is really important because somehow 20,000 plus ballots were printed just not by request of the county auditor, for good reason, because they were inactive voters. And then suddenly they were voted and they came in and they went through the machine and accepted just fine. This is a defective problem in the voting system, and I'm going to explain why here. Again, remember, you got to go back to what is it that a criminal would think about to do something dishonest, because you and I may not want to cheat in elections or do anything dishonest, but a criminal, if they can check the box, I think, of these 4 areas of looking at things, if they think it's worth the risk, which it is in elections, if the exposure is limited, you're unlikely to get caught, if you can keep it simple, make it a simple process, and if it's impossible to figure out later, that's a good crime and it's worth committing, especially if there's some money in it and somebody gets paid off along the way. It's certainly better than what these guys did in the cheap seats, trying to fill out fake voter registrations with Acorn and the unions in the Seattle Public Library. So it's better than that. So how could it be done? And this is the scenario that I believe has a potential to exist. I'm not trying to blame anybody. I don't think anybody at the Snohomish County Auditor's Office would even catch this, and they wouldn't have. Actually, we know for a fact they wouldn't have, and no other auditor's office in the state of Washington would have caught this had it not been for records requests filed by activists who are willing to actually look into it. So I think that's important to point out. K&H Printing is not none of these people are necessarily bad public entities, but they do have to have one corrupt guy somewhere in the process. And that guy could be working at K&H Printing. It doesn't have to be the company. I'm not even really picking on them. Could be whoever's working at whatever ballot printing house that you're using. You don't get away from this. If there's a corrupt employee working on the swing shift or the graveyard shift, this is a simple scenario. Because essentially all he needs is a thumb drive with the inactive voter list that somebody compiles for him. Now, there's obviously more than one corrupt person in this, but it's a very small group and only one person with exposure, which is the employee who might work at that particular printing facility. And all he has to do is just accidentally print a bad list. Listen, they're printing 60 million ballots in a given year. A small run of 20 some odd thousand ballots that are bad is not a big deal. It's people make mistakes. If you ever worked for a print shop, please, I can promise you there are screw-ups that happen all the time. Back when my manufacturing days and I used to have to source stuff out of print shops, I saw it myself. I know that it happens, and it would happen printing ballots just like anything else. These things can happen. People make a mistake. Oops, I'm sorry, my bad. And let's take that, intercept that bad batch. Let's throw it in recycling. Only it never really gets in recycling, just ends up in the back of a van. And the one insider, because I think you could do this with just one bad apple there, could take those ballots that are on the same paper, the same database, same printing, everything's done correctly, same batch of paper even that you're running the regular ballots on, and this is a bad batch. Oops, my mistake, let's throw it in recycling. It doesn't show up on any record because it's just, it's not even a rounding error in the amount of volume of recycling you'd have in a big operation like this. He ends up in his van, goes out the door, gets delivered to whoever needs it. Now, maybe it's that warehouse over in Lake Stevens or Bothell or some other place. You don't really know, and that's something that guy doesn't have to know. As long as he gets his cash and he gets it delivered, gives him back the thumb drive, there is no evidence left that anything like this ever happened. Again, bring yourself back to the priorities of a criminal. If it is worth the risk, if there's limited exposure, which there would be very limited exposure here, as long as the one guy who works at the print shop keeps his mouth closed and he's paid enough to keep his mouth closed. He's not like the $10 an hour guy working at the Seattle Public Library trying to get writer's cramp filling out fake voter registrations. This is way easier than that. And keep it simple. And it's very simple. You don't have to try to make up fake paper. All you need is a handful of people sitting there in that warehouse you're just doing the fake signatures that they need, and that's a separate conversation because the signature validation process is very limited. It doesn't work as well as people think it does, and that's a separate story. But basically, this is impossible for you to go back and figure out. We did pull a records request on those envelopes and looked at those envelopes. When I say we, I'm talking about the people up in Snohomish County who were focused on exposing what they had stumbled on here. And if you look at the back of the envelopes, most of them were signed. They weren't screen printed on. They were actually signed with a pen, and multiple different types of pens, right, to make it look different. But somebody actually signed those envelopes. So you got a warehouse, you got 6 or 7 decent paid guys. It's not hard to process 20,000 or more, 22,000 ballots, and that can make an impact. And if you look back in the number of people that voted in Snohomish County, that's about a 4.5% percentage of those ballots that would have been questionable if you'd had some kind of a system to catch this before it actually went out. That's a significant number, and that's enough to change the outcome of very close races, of which there were several in Snohomish County. You would have a city council race, not so much city council, but you'd have county commission races, you'd have certainly legislative races in swing districts, you'd have other things where that could make a big difference. I'm not saying it's the only thing that would be going on. I'm saying it's an easy thing to go on. And under our current system, there is nothing set up in Washington State that will ever catch this, no matter how many times people do it. Even now that I'm telling you about this, because of how long it takes to get records back, because of the fact that nobody in government really wants to know, because this is essentially how they respond right here. We see nothing, hear nothing, say nothing, and we will not look. And that attitude, unfortunately, is part of the problem that we have. Mail-in voting encourages and incentivizes people to not look too deep behind the black box secret sauce system that's been set up for elections, and they make it almost impossible. It takes Herculean effort by activists like these people in Snohomish County, like other people, to actually dig in and get to the bottom of this. And there's a lot of false trails along the way, caused partially by the secret sauce black box system that gets set up to conceal a lot of this information from the public. It is an issue. And it should be no surprise that there's also a lot of people, consultants, political people, even the people in your own party, they don't want to listen to this. This is a story they don't want to hear. Nobody wants to know how this kind of stuff can happen, even though if you've ever done anything in loss prevention or audits or financial controls or anything else, you should be looking at potential ways to do bad things and preventing them from being able to happen. But the last thing anybody wants to do in elections is even raise the question that something like the scenario that I outlined below or previously here could happen, and yet it can. There is nothing set up in the system to stop this from happening. And it doesn't require corruption inside of the Snohomish County Auditor's Office, for example. Again, the saints and the apostles could all be working there, and none of them would ever catch this system. You could make an argument that even the clear ballot machine, the automatic default that assumes, provided that the data is correct in the sense the barcode matches the person, you could say that system isn't necessarily corrupt. K&H printing, this would be done without the knowledge or awareness of the people who work there, except for all it would take is one corrupt employee. And if you pay enough money, you're always going to find one in any kind of operation like this. So this is possible. I'm not throwing anybody specifically into the bus and saying that they were absolutely involved in it. I'm just saying that this is not something that the current program that we have running in Washington State would ever catch. And it's simply one of many examples of how you can commit fraud in elections and do bad things in the election system that we have today. So this is the basic history of this story. This is the story that I wanted to tell. I should have told this like a year and a half ago when we'd kind of finalized some of the stuff. We were hoping to get a little bit better information back from Snohomish County, like maybe somebody actually cared, but they don't, and nobody's going to do anything about it. And again, as each month goes by, that election becomes ancient history. So this is one of those issues where I think drawing attention to it now, for those who want to change how the election system is operating and make it so that it's more transparent, that it's more observable, that it's more auditable, then I want to use this as an example as one of the ways that bad actors can do bad things. This would be an easy way to do it. It looks like something like that happened in Snohomish County in 2020, and if you're willing to look at the same type of records that they did, you may find that it's happening where you live, or maybe it's not. Hopefully it's not. But nobody looks. This is the type of information that nobody's comparing. And I think it's important to talk about these kind of stories, as much as I realize the voter class and the political class certainly doesn't want me talking about it. Now, the big question, again, when I finish stories like this, especially depressing stories like this, is exactly what can you do as an activist or a concerned citizen to make an impact or a difference in whether it's this subject or anything else? Well, number one, again, there's obviously a movement to eliminate mail-in voting. I want this story to be an example that gets shared with a lot of people who are involved in that process, because I think that it's a good policy change to make. I think mail-in voting is corrupt by its nature, and it just encourages more corruption. And no matter how many games they try to play to prevent that, inevitably the system's just too easy to game. And obviously, with no chain of custody and anywhere in the process, scenarios like what I just outlined and what I think has actually happened in our state in the past, at least in Snohomish County in 2020, I think they can happen again, and nobody's looking, nobody's trying to stop it. Don't use the fact that I've simply exposed a bad behavior or something that may seem depressing or corrupting to you. Don't make it seem like, well, I'm just going to give up and surrender. And that's a weird attitude. I've never fully understood why people want to surrender at the first chance and opportunity they get, an excuse they can find. But the reality is, the only reason somebody would be doing something like this is because they're concerned that too many good people are voting differently than what they want. And I would argue anybody wanting to cheat like this or commit illegal activities like this is doing it for bad reasons and nefarious purposes, regardless of how self-righteous they probably are, somewhere along that equation probably, and somewhere in that food chain. But they are doing it illegally, dishonestly, and corruptly. And the reason why they're doing it is because they're concerned about you and how you're voting. And the fact that they are concerned they can't win legally or they can't win honestly, and they may not have even won some of these races, but they're willing to do dishonest and corrupt things like this to try to shift that needle just a little bit closer to where they want it to be. So that should not be a inspiration for you to abandon your efforts and be apathetic and sit on the couch instead and basically let the rest of the people try to solve the problems for you. It is a microscopic amount of effort for you in a given year to actually participate in an election process and vote the way you want to vote or the way you wish it would go. The more people that do that, the harder it is for people who want to do bad things and commit bad behavior to get away with it. And that's something I want to encourage people, and I'm never going to stop encouraging that because I think it matters. And then finally, of course, the one thing I always say is that this is a difficult project for anybody to work on. And I wouldn't encourage you to try to do this. Maybe smaller counties, this is a little bit easier process, but I'm less concerned about happening there. If you were trying to run the same data set in King County, for example, very difficult. It takes some very good knowledge of large volume data sets and how to do cross comparisons and some other issues skill sets that aren't super common to find. However, find a local project that you can work on where you can make a difference. This may seem overwhelming to you if you're watching this video, and it may seem very difficult, and I don't want to pretend that it's easy, but other things are much easier, and you can get involved and engage, whether that's your school district's city council, grant grifting operation, digging into the truth and exposing the truth that matters. And it matters just like it does for the activists who told me about filing these records requests originally, and Doug, I owe you an apology for I told you yes, but I honestly, deep in my heart, didn't think you were going to find anything, and I'm impressed that you guys stuck to it and uncovered the information that you did. But it was a good reminder to me that it's so important to look in places where, and having many people doing this stuff all over the place with different ideas and approaches, you're more likely to uncover the truth. Pick a project, something that's a passion project to you, that matters to you where you live, that's local, that you think you can manage. Put together your team of other people who are interested in getting involved in it, whatever it might be. You can make a difference, just like these people did, thanklessly, up in Snohomish County for multiple years to get to the bottom of this and expose a clear and obvious defect that exists in the current voting system in Washington State. Maybe they can find a way to patch this hole. I doubt it, but maybe. The point is that exposing the truth, making it harder for bad guys to do this stuff in the future is a good thing by itself, but what it really does expose is that inevitably vote by mail has a lot of deficiencies in it. This is just one example of one of the deficiencies that our system today will not stop or catch in Washington State, and probably not where you live either if you have mail-in voting and you're watching this video. So with that, I just want to encourage you to stay involved, stay engaged, just like these activists did up in Snohomish County. Do not be discouraged, stay involved. Stay focused. Don't make it easier for the bad guys. Sometimes just shine the light of truth on what's going on can shake the tree and good things can happen. But regardless, if you want good outcomes, it won't happen because you sit back and complain on the couch, run away, and pre-surrender. You have to be engaged in the process and be willing to do something about it. You have to be willing to show up. Because, as I always say, the future belongs to those who show up.